Welcome back to Hollywood Beatdown, the only show where my gigantic ego isn't hidden by a fake cloak of humbleness. So, two genres that have always kind of blended together pretty well are horror and comedy. It makes a lot of sense because in a lot of ways horror isn't really a genre that takes itself too seriously, especially not when you get into the more low-budget B-movie horror films. Many of the best horror movies and best comedies have been films that are hybrids of the two, so I thought why not talk about the best of these. As I said in the best horror sequels list, this list is purely opinion based. Just because you disagree with me and have a different list doesn't mean either of us are wrong. Except of course for you, because everything I say is fact. Also remember, I've not seen every movie ever made, so there's a lot of films that people would put on their list that are missing, so take everything I say with a grain of salt. So, let's get into it. Here are my top 10 best horror comedies.
Spooky, scary skeletons and shivers down your spine. Shrieking skulls will shock your soul.
Number 10. Scary Movie. Remember when Scary Movie was just a silly Scream parody made by the Wayans brothers and not a brand that spawned some of the worst parody movies and really just worst comedies in general ever made? The original Scary Movie takes some of the biggest movies of the 90s, mostly Scream and I Know What You Did Last Summer, and lampoons them in the crudest and most ridiculous way possible. The film is similar to all those shit parody movies that followed in how it follows the plot of one film and throws in random jokes and references here and there. But the difference with those in this film is that the jokes are actually funny. At least for the most part they are anyway. There is a lot that is cringy and doesn't hit at all, but there's also a lot of jokes that are hilarious and incredibly memorable. The film is really over the top, cartoony and full of slapstick, but there's also a lot of smart humour sprinkled in there too. I mean, it's not there too often, but it's still there, hidden somewhere. Not to mention the performances are all really good also, especially from the main cast, all of whom are incredibly memorable and lovable throughout the film. The film is one that probably doesn't hold up too well, especially for people who aren't really accustomed to 90s comedies, but I personally really like it. It actually used to be one of my favourites and I would watch it and its first 3 sequels constantly. This series would go on to become a juggernaut throughout the 2000s with sequels that, although may have been mediocre at best, still had some charm in them and a lot of really funny, unforgettable moments as well. This series was stopped dead in its tracks with the absolutely atrocious Scary Movie 5, but yeah, we don't talk about that one. Before the team behind the Naked Gun series took over the movies, Scary Movie was a simple, stupid Scream parody, one that I still enjoy after all these years. Number 9. Killer Clowns from Outer Space. Man, I love this film so much. When it comes to cheesy, ridiculous B-movies, you can't get much better than Killer Clowns from Outer Space. The film is about a group of alien clowns who take over a small town and turn the townspeople into cotton candy which they intend to take back to their home planet. The plot of the film is as ridiculous as it sounds. This isn't a film that should be taken seriously in the slightest. It's a film that you can switch your brain off to and just have a really good time. It's incredibly creative and original, and the designs of the clowns are actually really quite creepy in this weird, surrealistic way. The film is in some ways a parody of 1950s B-movies. It has a monster movie style reminiscent of films like The Blob, but they play around with this idea, and instead of making a straight parody, they make a film that kind of stands out on its own. The film is very strange, and I remember the first time I saw it, I was kind of confused as to what I'd just watched, but over repeated viewings, it's become a film that I really enjoy. If I'm in the mood for something really terrible yet really funny, I throw it on. It's a film that is intentionally bad but tries to have fun with it. It doesn't get boring like intentionally bad movies nowadays do, and all things considered, it's actually really well crafted. The effects of the film are really what steal the show though. Every single set piece and death scene look fantastic, and I love the design of the clowns. Instead of just throwing makeup on some guys and getting them to act all spooky, they create these huge elaborate suits to look fantastic. This film is really great. Honestly, it being so low on this list is just a testament to how good the other movies are. Number 8. An American Werewolf in London. Okay, maybe a bad idea to do this list this week, considering that this is a film I'm reviewing in a couple weeks. So excuse me if I repeat a lot of what I say in that review here. But if you want to see me talk more in depth about the film, that review is going to be coming out on the 24th. An American Werewolf in London is a weird one, because it's one that has parts where the film is undoubtedly a comedy and parts where it's a horror movie. Instead of blending the styles together, they kind of devote entire scenes to each one of the genres, which does work in many ways. The film is at times hilarious and at times really quite scary. John Landis's classic horror comedy is considered by many to be one of the best in both of the genres, and I completely see why. As funny as the film may be at times, I think what really steals the show in this film are the werewolf scenes, especially the iconic transformation scene, which is easily the best moment in the film. Honestly, that scene is worth the price of admission alone. The werewolf scenes are a lot of fun, incredibly exciting, and just well done in general. The effects are just top notch, seriously some of the best effects ever put on film even to this day. I think this film is one that works better as a horror movie than a comedy, but there are still some really funny moments. However, I do think it's kind of sad that despite the fact Rick Mail is in the film, he doesn't really do a lot. They had one of the greatest British comedians who's ever lived, and yet they didn't do anything with him. Oh well, it's not a big criticism, just something I thought about while rating this video. I'd say this film is only on the list because of how good a film it is and less because of how it balances out horror and comedy. I think for the most part the film is kind of just a horror movie with some comedic moments. But regardless, it's a great film that I look forward to talking about very soon. Number 7. The Return of the Living Dead. Pretty weird, but I just realised that, in my opinion, the best non-Romero zombie movies are actually comedies that parody his movies. The Return of the Living Dead is exactly that. A pair of idiotic employees at a medical supply warehouse accidentally release a toxic gas which reanimates corpses all over the town. This then sets off a chain reaction which leads to a full-blown zombie attack. Making fun of the zombie genre with its nihilistic punk rock tone, the film is an incredibly entertaining movie. It kind of feels like a zombie parody that you'd expect to see in a cartoon like The Simpsons or something, spread out into an entire film. It has all the conventions and basic ideas that become synonymous with the genre, but it does it in a way that is incredibly fast-paced and hilarious. The performances in the film are fantastic. It's obvious these actors all understand comedy and they have the perfect timing and delivery in each scene. Not to mention there are moments in the film that are genuinely quite disturbing and even scary. The film is very gory and the gore scenes are really well done. When the zombies appear, the film starts to become more and more serious, and I think that the switch between the two works really well. It doesn't end up like some other films that do a similar style and feel jarring at all. Also, the film has a really great soundtrack made up of punk and death rock bands such as The Cramps, TSOL, The Damned, and 45 Grave. Anyone who is into punk or death rock should definitely check out the soundtrack to this film because it's really great. If you're into zombie movies, this film is a must-see. It's, in my opinion, one of the best. Number 6. Young Frankenstein. Mel Brooks is the master of the parody movie. He honestly is one of my favourite directors and has made some of my favourite comedies ever made. He knows exactly how to make a parody movie that doesn't feel forced, cringy, and isn't filled with incredibly dated references. At least not for the most part anyway. He's parodied westerns, silent movies, Hitchcock movies, historical epics, Star Wars, Robin Hood, and Hammer horror movies. But my favourite of his parodies has to be his film Young Frankenstein, a spoof of Universal monster movies. Although Mel Brooks' movies really did start to go downhill later on in his career, Young Frankenstein is a perfect snapshot of him at his best. Co-written by the film's star Gene Wilder, this film has one of the smartest scripts in a comedy ever made. His script was even nominated for an Oscar due to how great it is. The film is incredibly absurd and mixes slapstick with more subtle humour just to the T. The deliveries, timing and performances from every actor are all perfect. Every single joke in the film hits incredibly hard. I watched this film recently for the first time in quite a few years and I couldn't stop laughing throughout the entire thing, especially in scenes like the walk this way scene and the musical number at the end. The film lovingly sends up Universal horror movies and does a great job of replicating the look of them almost exactly. If you're a fan of the original Frankenstein movies, then you'll love this film, but similarly, if you're just a fan of classic comedies, then you'll love this film also. It's one that comes highly recommended. Number 5. Evil Dead 2. I'm really making up for my review being taken down now by talking about this film so much this month. And yet this isn't even the last time this film's going to be on a list this month. Evil Dead 2 is by far my favourite film in the series. It's the perfect balance between the straight horror style of the first movie and the completely comedic style of the third movie. It's very serious at times, but it's also incredibly silly and over the top. Full of slapstick humour and incredibly dark surrealist humour, this film is one that knows exactly how to make you laugh, scare you and make you feel uncomfortable. It's the perfect balance between the three. Sam Raimi's directing is perfect and he masters the timing in this film, which is something that could have easily gone completely wrong. Ash's one-liners are hilarious and incredibly memorable. Just as a whole, this is an extremely well-made movie, but I'm not going to talk too much about it because I talked about it in the last list I did and it's going to be in another list this month also, so let's hold off a bit and talk about it more in that one. Number 4. Fright Night. Okay, so I'm not going to talk too much about Fright Night for the simple reason that I'm going to be reviewing the entire series next week. Fright Night is an incredibly camp and fun horror movie. It was a great film to kind of offset the large amount of slasher movies coming out at the time. It was a vampire movie in 1985, quite a rare thing to see, and yet it's one of the best horror movies of the decade. The film is an incredibly fast-paced, hilarious and exciting movie. It has great acting from the entire cast, especially Chris Sarandon and Roddy McDowall, not to mention some of the best special effects from the decade. Everything looks great and the creature designs are incredibly memorable and have stuck with me ever since I first watched it. It's a film that comes highly recommended, and to hear me talk about it more, check out my full review which will be out on the 16th. Number 3. Shaun of the Dead. Edgar Wright's Cornetto trilogy is honestly just fantastic. Although I consider The World's End to be the only one I don't love, Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz remain two of my favourite films ever made. Shaun of the Dead is by far my favourite in the trilogy and one that I can watch countless times and never get bored of. Every time I watch it, I find myself laughing at every single joke and feeling incredibly tense during the final act. Edgar Wright's directing is spot on. Every single scene feels perfectly calculated. Not to mention the writing in this film is just stellar. It's very distinctive of that early 2000s British comedy, but it's done in a unique way where it still feels like it could be timeless. The jokes are still as funny now as they've ever been. The performances are all really great also, especially from Simon Pegg and Nick Frost, both of whom are hilarious from start to finish. The jokes are hilarious, the writing is fantastic, the directing is just perfect, and everything about this film is great. I honestly can't think of any issues with this film. It's as close to perfect as you can possibly get and easily one of my all-time favourites. Number 2. Gremlins. I'm not gonna make that I'm a bit of a fan of Gremlins joke again. I'm sure you guys have guessed that this is one of my favourite movies and has been for a long time. My YouTube name came about because I was a big fan of the film when I was about 8 and I thought of the name Gizmo and my initials when I was creating my first RuneScape account. Yeah, remember when that was a thing? and it still is for some reason. And since then, I've watched the film more times than I can count. Although I've not watched it in a couple years now, it's still a film I hold near and dear to my heart for many good reasons. Written by Chris Columbus, directed by Joe Dante, and produced by Steven Spielberg, the film from the get-go had a fantastic team behind it, so there was very little chance that the final film wouldn't end up being so great. The film takes the wholesome small-town Christmas movie and mixes it in with a horrific B-movie. The creature designs are fantastic and the puppeteering in general looks top-notch. Everything looks so lifelike, it's incredibly impressive and holds up really well to this day. I remember when I first watched the film, the Gremlins absolutely terrified me because of how realistic they looked, and whenever I watch the film I always find myself escaping into it and forgetting the fact that they're just puppets. They look fantastic, and although they're not scary in the slightest anymore and are really hilarious to watch, I still think they're some of the best creatures in horror history. The film can be incredibly dark at times, but its dark humor is what really makes the film so entertaining. It may put off some people, but I think it's hilarious. The film is the perfect creature feature, a gigantic leap above the swarm of movies that came along in the wake of the film. Still to this day, one of my all-time favourites and one of my favourite Christmas movies also. So as always, there were a lot of films I wanted to talk about that just missed the list. So we're going to talk about a few honourable mentions that were cut out for one reason or another. Zombieland. Remember when this film was like the biggest thing in the world for a couple years? Zombieland is a film that came out just as zombies were starting to become massive again. Instead of being like the other zombie movies on the list, the film isn't really a parody of zombie movies and is more just a zombie movie that happens to be a comedy. The film is incredibly fast paced, it throws you into the action straight away and doesn't let up until the very end. It throws jokes at you a mile a minute, some hit and some miss, but luckily the majority of the jokes hit. The film only just missed out being on the list, but I thought I should at least give it a spot on the honourable mentions, otherwise people would probably complain. The Frighteners. Before directing the Lord of the Rings movies, Peter Jackson started his career by directing weird horror comedies. Although Brain Dead, also known as Dead Alive, is considered to be his best, my personal favourite is The Frighteners. This supernatural horror comedy is one that a lot of people seem to overlook for some reason, but I think it's fantastic. It bridges the gap between the weird B-movie style of Jackson's earlier movies and the more big-budget Hollywood movies he'd go on to make. The film is a big special effects spectacle about a Ghostbuster played by Michael J. Fox. The film is the perfect blend of horror, comedy, and drama. There are moments that are scary, hilarious, and incredibly emotional. It's such a well-made film that I highly recommend. It has a great cast, great script, and it has special effects. Yeah, the effects don't hold up well at all, but the rest of the film makes up for that. It's a unique premise and is incredibly entertaining. One that I love and one that narrowly missed the list. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. So for some reason, Tobe Hooper decided to follow up one of the scariest movies ever made with a weird comedy. Texas Chainsaw 2 is one that still to this day divides people due to its very surreal and odd tone. The film could have easily rehashed the plot of the original or become an average slasher movie like the third movie ended up being, but instead it took things in a completely different direction and ended up being unlike any other horror sequel I've ever seen. With its fast-paced, dark humor and over-the-top acting, this is a film that is a lot of fun to watch. The film takes things in a more satirical direction and also has some fantastic gore effects from Tom Savini. Not to mention that Dennis Hopper is hilarious in this film and a lot of fun to watch. It's a film where you really have to be open and accept the fact that it's something completely different to the first film. Otherwise, I think you're just gonna really be put off and will probably hate it. And finally, The Lost Boys. This is one that I really wanted to put on the list, but in the end, it just missed out because there were so many good films that I wanted to put on there. The Lost Boys is a fantastic movie. I reviewed the trilogy a couple years ago and I remember really liking the first movie especially. The film is a lot of fun, it's incredibly fast paced, has some fantastic effects, really great acting and superb directing from the internet's favourite punching bag, Joel Schumacher. It's a very stylish film that is obviously a product of the 80s. The film looks beautiful and its look and style is honestly incredibly unique, even despite its slight 80s tinge. It's not a film that I think is a pure masterpiece or anything, but it's a film that you can put on and have a hell of a fun time. The only reason I didn't put it on the main list is because, honestly, I consider it to be more of a horror movie than a comedy. Although there are slight comedic moments in the film, a lot of the humour is subtle. The film, for the most part, is pretty serious. So because of that, I couldn't put it on the list, but if I did, it would have been pretty high up on the list because it's definitely a film that I'm a really big fan of.
Scary skeletons and shivers down your spine.
And the number one and best horror comedy is The Rocky Horror Picture Show. I wonder how many people are going to get angry about this one. I've never really talked about Rocky Horror on this channel, but I am a huge fan of this movie. I would honestly consider it to be in my top 5, maybe even top 3 all-time favorites. It's one I can watch over and over and over again and still enjoy the hell out of. It's incredibly stupid and cheesy, but that's what makes it so great. The film is by far my favourite musical. The music in this movie is fantastic. For the few people who don't know anything about this film, it's a homoerotic rock and roll musical about aliens from the planet of transsexual in the universe of Transylvania. Yeah, the movie is as stupid as it sounds. The film is heavily inspired by 50s B-movies and is in many ways a loving homage to them. The film is pretty much the definition of camp. Everything is so cheesy and over the top and incredibly homoerotic. There is literally a character in there who is a transvestite who even sings a song about the fact he's a transvestite. Everything is so cheesy and over the top, from the set designs and look of the film to Tim Curry's performance. The acting from the human characters is obviously quite cheesy to fit in with the feel of that B-movie style. Not to mention the dialogue is pretty terrible also. But the film is just so ridiculous and it's obvious that everyone involved is just having the time of their lives, and because of that, so do you. The music is incredibly catchy and fun. I honestly find myself listening to songs from the soundtrack all the time. The opening track to the film's science fiction double feature is legitimately one of my favourite songs ever written. The film has an incredibly unique style that, although films have tried to replicate, none have really come quite as close to doing so. If you take this film serious in any way, you are going to absolutely hate it. It's not a serious movie. It's a really stupid movie, but that's why I love it so much. It's expertly crafted and the musical numbers are fantastic. Not just musically great, but the choreography and everything is just perfect. I honestly think this is one of the films I've seen the most, along with films like the first 2 Toy Story movies. Yeah, a little bit different there, yeah. I love it so much and can watch it a billion times without getting sick of it. It's definitely an acquired taste and a lot of people are going to hate it. And I'm sure people are going to argue that it's not a horror comedy, but hey, it's my list and it says so on Wikipedia, and Wikipedia is never wrong, so be quiet. So there we go. There are what I think are the best horror comedies ever made. Do you disagree with everything I said? Most likely yes. If so, let me know in the comment section below so I can delete your comment and block you from my channel. If you have a different list, let me know what your personal list is in the comment section also. So there we go. Thanks for watching Hollywood Beatdown, and remember, it's not illegal if there's no evidence tying you to the crime scene.